Look, again, I don't think it's incoherent to be a two-boxer. It's just that it's incoherent to be a two-boxer and admit moral hazard of the kind the problem is meant to afford. Now, I don't think I'm going to be saying much different than that in content, no matter how we color the options and the consequences.
So welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Teddy Seidenfeld. He is Herbert A. Simon University Professor of Philosophy and Statistics at Carnegie Mellon University, and his work focuses on decision theory, statistics, and related topics. He has a wide variety of published works on these topics and more, including a book edited with Joseph Cadane and Mark Servish, Rethinking the Foundations of Statistics. Feel free to add anything. But with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Seidenfeld.
Thank you, Troy. That's a very welcome invitation. Thanks.
All right. So, there's a few different things I want to cover. I did want to start with this paper you wrote a while back called, I found it really fascinating, called Is Ignorance Bliss? And in that, you kind of more formally explore the idea that it may be sometimes rational to avoid so-called cost-free information, or even to pay to not receive it. And we'll get into what this means and some of the conditions under which it might be rational to do so. But just as a introduction, I could sort of see an argument for and against it, right? So on one hand, we might think that, certain undesired outcomes are more likely to obtain if we had certain information. But on the other hand, it's just free information. How could it hurt? It's at most, it could just help us to make a more informed decision, right? So anyway, I'll leave it there. Maybe you can comment a bit on these sort of intuitions, those sorts of responses, and about how you approach this issue, if that's good.
Sure. So that paper is written with Mark and Jay. We've collaborated for more than 40 years. Is a composite of some problems we explore in other papers, mostly with a very neat result that I think the shortest argument in support of the result that we're exploring is due to Jack Good from the late 1960s, 67 or so, in which Good gives an elegant argument. He's not the first. This has been around for a while, which is a decision theoretic argument. And so this is a theme I want to underscore and endorse, and that's why I'm taking the moment to present it this way. It says that by combining beliefs with actions and seeing how actions follow from beliefs, you learn a lot about the theory of rational belief. Not that you're trying to reduce belief to decisions, but by seeing what the consequences are of beliefs through the decisions they endorse, you get a better handle on rationality. And Good says that if you think of information in an instrumental way, namely as guiding you toward decisions, there's this very neat result from within a simplified Bayesian or expected utility framework that says if you can choose between making a decision now, some canonical decision now, given what you know now, with a menu of options fixed, and alternatively, you can postpone that decision in order to acquire an outcome of an experiment. Let's call it an experiment. The reason it's formulated as an experiment is you have to anticipate the different ways the experiment might turn out. You have to survey all the things you might learn. So it's already restrictive in the sense that you have to anticipate what you might learn. And Good says, produces this marvelous result that says, if you can imagine this experiment giving you an outcome that would change your behavior. So the rules of rationality would say, were I to learn this new information, E1, from the experiment, I would choose differently than I would choose now. Then it pays in expected utility sense to postpone the decision for the opportunity to acquire that information. So it's a very neat behavioral check, which says if the information might change my behavior, then it's worth trying to get that information as a cost-free opportunity. Now, the question, so this is an instrumental value of information. It's information for guiding decision. And it says, and of course, as a member of a private university, I advertise this result to tell the students why they're justified in paying all that tuition for their education, because it will get them to make better decisions. But that framework is, I think, an interesting one because of the intimacy between the decision theoretic component and the more traditional epistemological component of how I should govern my beliefs. Under what conditions should I try and improve my beliefs, and why? So that's the background. And then the point is, this is a mathematical result. It has assumptions. And you can say, well, under what conditions will the change in the assumptions turn this result around? And you can turn it around quite dramatically depending on how you fill out some of the mathematical details. We could walk through some of those assumptions in a qualitative way, but the general point of the paper is to say, well, this is a mathematical result. It's a very interesting result. It's got assumptions. The assumptions don't hold all the time. When the assumptions don't hold, what do the results lead to? And they can turn things around just the opposite way, so that the result of learning in certain cases, when you fill out the mathematical details, can in fact make the decision making worse by your current lights. That is, your current lights say, I have a decision which I can cleanly evaluate, and the information might be confusing in a way that would violate one of the mathematical assumptions in Good's argument, and that confusion might result in a decision which, from my current point of view, is not as effective as the decision I can make now. That would reverse the problem. Maybe an example of the following sort would help. Let's suppose that our decision maker is not a single agent, but two people. So I'm already shifting into a setting in where there's a kind of a group decision problem. And it might be that right now the group is pretty clear on wanting to choose A over B or over C. That is, right now the group assessment says, yeah, it's reasonable as a group to choose A over B or A over C. Now, you can conduct an experiment where, under one outcome of the experiment, C, I said A over B over C, I think is the way I was saying it, A rather than B or C. You can conduct an experiment where afterwards one of the agents says, well, given what I've learned, I now think that A is no longer the best, I want B. And the other agent says, yeah, given that outcome, I agree with you, A is not best, but it's C now that's best. And for every outcome of the experiment, the agreement before that A was the better one in unanimity gets replaced with a judgment where the parties no longer can agree. And you're going to be stuck now with some sort of compromise, which is going to cause people to have to be uncomfortable with the compromise in a way there was no need to compromise before. So this is a situation where the extra information brings out hidden disagreements that was not present in the initial formulation. So yeah, the initial formulation allowed for an agreement, but it allowed for an agreement because the agents didn't have to confront certain uncomfortable information, which, if they confronted, would cause them to become in disagreement. So now the question is, under those circumstances, do you want to cause conflict, polarize the group by causing them to learn the new information? Or is it better to decide now where at least they can explain the basis for their decision, recognizing that, yeah, the decision might be overturned, but how are we going to act when we have conflict? That's a beginning of the feel for how the extra information can, in a group setting, cause unanimity to break apart, and the experiment might in fact predictively produce a polarization of opinion, which would lead to a compromise decision that both parties find less satisfactory than the initial one from the initial point of view. I don't know if that gives a hint as to how some of this mathematics might work when you walk away from the assumptions that Good is using. In Good's setting, there's only one agent with one well-defined opinion. Here, what I'm trading on is the fact that the agent might be a group with multiple opinions, and sometimes information can cause unanimities to break apart and become polarized. And then the question is, would you want to drive the group into such a conflicted situation? They would know more, but they still have to act as a group. And the grounds for group decision-making when there's that kind of polarization become less compelling.
Right. That's good. I mean, we might think of the polarization, the group polarization, as a cost, right, to be factored into our decision-making.
Yeah.
And
But yeah, I mean, you could do it that way. And then, of course, Good would get out of the problem by saying, well, it's not cost-free information. But in the sense in which he's talking about, it doesn't cost you anything to run the experiment and absorb the information. In that sense, it's cost-free. But then the theorem that he's working with won't produce the desired outcome, because his theorem, the theorem he works with, uses a single probability distribution. And what's lurking in the background here is the group has more than one opinion for the individuals.
Right. We could even put it like this. They have differing sort of conditional probability distributions that sort of come out in the wash when we, Good. I do want to get to some more examples, and what do you think about that? But before that, maybe it's first to step back and think about, what does cost-free mean here, right? Because, like, I don't know. I mean, you might think kind of informally. I mean, there's cases where you can get some information where it doesn't cost you any money or like any effort to get it, but that's too weak, maybe even in some cases too strong to count as being cost-free. I mean, maybe it could be costly in another sense. So I don't know. How would you construe it here?
So in this case, we could go back and look at this example with just one decision maker and agree that, however we're talking about cost-free, Good would say in this case that information is cost-free. And now I'm saying, in that sense of cost-free, when you add the second decision maker, you can get this problem. And it seems to me a bit ad hoc to say now suddenly the information is not cost-free, because it violates the conclusion of the theorem. Really what's happened is we've switched from one probability to multiple probabilities and noted that the theorem is not valid in that broader setting. I would not try and save the theorem by saying this is a case in which the information has become cost-free. Let's just take a case where for the single agent, we're prepared to say it's cost-free so we could apply Good's result. And now just say that aspect of the problem has not changed, but now we're working with a group agent of two, and something else happens in terms of the way the result doesn't work.
Yeah, but I guess, but I mean, even aside from forgetting the case of the group decision problem, just generally, how are we supposed to understand?
Oh yeah. So I was just simply saying that I think there's a way of avoiding that issue contaminating this example. But you still need to define. Good would need to define what it means to be cost-free as well. We try and do that by asking how the outcomes of the decision are changed by having to learn this extra information. And now it's a question of what you put utility over. For example, to use a different illustration that we go through in the setting, if your utility is of a more subtle sort and involves, say, value of uncertainty. For example, we use a taxi driver example where you're going to, this is a single agent problem. You're going to the theater to see a play, but the play is a mystery. and you get in the taxi, and the taxi driver hears where you're going, knows the outcome of the whodunit, and subtly bribes you, extorts you into a big tip by threatening to reveal who did it. In that case, the information about who did it would be costly to you for changing the value of the experience in the theater. You wouldn't. I mean, if you believe the taxi driver, you wouldn't have the same value of enjoying the uncertainty of seeing the plot evolve on the stage. So there, I mean, the question of what counts as cost-free and information is subtle because it depends on what you're valuing in connection with this decision. And so the taxi driver taxi driver example would be one in which I think our analysis says once the taxi driver has posed the extortion to you that way, it's no longer cost-free information.
Right. Because you sort of directly value not having that information, or indirectly in that.
Yeah, but the taxi driver, by threatening to reveal the information, would change the value to you of sitting in the theater and enjoying the mystery. So it would be information that would have negative value. It would be costly to you in the sense that it would deprive you of the value, or would reduce the value of the experience in the theater.
Right. Yeah. So that makes sense. But then the question is, for cases where you don't have something like that, where we want to count it as cost-free, how to deal with that. So I was thinking of a kind of class of examples and wonder what you think about where this would fall. So suppose you could receive information about like how to launch nuclear weapons, and a quote unquote no cost to you, but you also expect, and you have no desire to actually launch them or cause a nuclear war or anything like that. But you think that if you knew how to launch the nuclear weapons, there's somewhat of a greater chance that you would develop that desire, right? Maybe you think that, like, I don't know, having that power is going to incur this preference in you to some degree. Now, you might want to argue. I think I would argue that it's rational for you to now avoid getting this information, maybe even paying a substantial fee to avoid it, depending on how much you care about avoiding the war and how strongly you expect your preferences to change. Now, how would you analyze this case? Would this count as a case of cost-free? Yeah.
I think there's probably more than one way to slice the bologna in this case, but my instinct is like yours, at least what I'm guessing yours is, that this is not a case of cost-free or costly information. It's more a case in which you have a kind of act-state dependence, in which by doing something, you change the value in a predictable way of some other consequence. So here, the cases I have in mind are cases like addiction cases that Peter Hammond has studied, the economist, and worrying about, well, if I indulge a little bit, that will change my sense of riskiness, and then I will be willing to tolerate a more risky indulgence next time I'm offered the intoxicant or whatever it is. And from my current point of view, the problem is that engaging in some mild indulgence causes a change in my uncertainty and a change in my judgment of riskiness in a way I wouldn't say that's the cost of the business. That's more changing states of my utility in the future me. So that's a kind of act-state dependence where doing something now changes the action of someone later. The someone later is me later. So I would be inclined to view it that way, as a kind of act-state dependence where there's moral hazard. Doing something now changes the probability I have now that something will happen in the future. In this case, by indulging now, I change the probability of my future risky behavior.
Right. So this case.
So in this case, learning the information, I heard you to say the worry is that I would be tempted into, I don't know, something that I would this point view as very unpleasant. And so I'm changing the probability now about a later decision.
Right.
The action of another person later. The other person is me later, who I cannot directly control now.
Right. So in the context of cost-free information stuff, I mean, does it count as cost-free? And I mean,
this counts as cost-free, but it violates a different of Good's assumptions. One of the assumptions in Good's argument is that there's no moral hazard. I mean, to use a simple example, there's a very simple example, I think, that illustrates this point. Suppose I have a choice between two options, A and B, where by my current lights, A is better than B, and maybe by a fixed amount. I could, however, engage in an inquiry where I have to set up an experiment. The experiment is cost-free, but the experiment changes, the creation of the experiment changes my opinion about the states and reduces the value of A from what it was before. It's still better, but it's not better by as much. The experiment itself may be irrelevant, so it doesn't change my opinion about anything, but the choosing to conduct the experiment does, because I'm doing things in the world to set up the experiment. And that might influence the states that are relevant to comparing A with B, and it may decrease the value of A without making B better. So it's a situation, Mark Twain had a good quip on this. He says, politicians behave differently when observed. And so the decision to observe the politician will change the politician's behavior. In this case, we're seeing this change in a way, not for the better, but for the worse, in that when I set up the experiment, I move things around in such a way that Act A has a lower value than it did before. Still better, but not as good as it was. So that's state dependence. And there I would choose not to explore this with this experiment. If my decision is still between A and B, it makes the choice of A less desirable afterwards than it is now. Not because I've learned anything as a result of the experiment, but the setting up the decision to conduct the experiment, the doing the experiment has interfered with states in such a way that A is not as good as it used to be.
Okay. So explicitly then, so one of Good's assumptions for the argument is that there is this act state independence. This violates that.
Yes.
And then the way it violates that is that here we have it, you could model as a kind of sequential decision problem, one regarding obtaining the information and then the later decision.
Exactly.
And what you do now affects the state later, be it how you're disposed to behave or whatever, that sort of thing. And that's
right.
Right. And so
yes, and that's not covered by Good's result.
Right.
Good's result has the simple assumption that the setting up of the experiment doesn't change any of the states that you're trying to investigate.
Right.
But if setting up the experiment is convoluted with the states that you're trying to experiment, you can imagine situations where the experiment changes just setting up the experiment changes the distribution of the states before you've conducted the experiment to see what happens, in such a way that it reduces the benefit associated with an Act A, which is the better act in any case, between A and B.
Okay. So I was thinking of another example that I think is going to also violate state independence, but
well, I mean, maybe this theme connects up with where you're going. A sequential game would be the case, where I'm going to play first, you're going to see how I play, and then you're going to play. And if I do A, then for you, A prime is better. And if I do B, then for you, B prime is better. And it might be that when you do B, that the result of your choice gets, if I know you're doing B prime, then it's better for me to do A prime than it is A, even though, I've got this mixed up. Let's start again. I've got a choice between A and B. There are two states of uncertainty. whether you do A prime or you do B prime. It could be that my A dominates my B. If you do A prime, I'm better off doing A than B. If you do B prime, I'm better off doing A than B. But nonetheless, it may be that I don't want to do A, because when you do A, when I do A, you choose A prime and I get an outcome. But if I do B, you choose B prime. And B prime and B are better than A prime and A, even though A dominates B. We could set up the numbers simply so that that happens. And in that case, I rather do B than A, even though A dominates B, because in doing B, I bring about B prime. If I do A, I bring about A prime, as your choice, because that's better for you. So a sequential decision, quite obviously, can be one in which there's act-state dependent. What I choose influences what you choose, and that kind of influence can result in a violation of simple dominance. Maybe some numbers would help. We can even do it in the air here. We've got a 2x2 table, 2 rows for my options, 2 columns for your options. And in terms of my payments are two in column 1, 2 for A and 1 for B. So if you do A prime, I get 2. And then in column B, when you do B prime, the second column, when I do A, I get 4. And if you do B prime, and if I do B and you do B prime, I get 3. So it's 2, 1, 4, 3 reading of it. So there's simple dominance. But notice 3 is better than 2. So if when I do A, you do A prime, I get 2. And if I do B, when you do B prime, I get 3. So I rather get 3 than 2. So I take B rather than A. I don't know if that makes the example clear enough.
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, the general point about how, at least in this sort of sequential problems, you get.
Yeah, act-state dependence can overturn dominance.
Right.
And Good's argument is operating in a setting where dominance applies. So that would not be applicable if you had act-state dependence.
Right. Okay, yeah, that definitely makes sense. I did. So sort of as an aside, although it's going to come back to a related example, I wanted to bring up Newcomb's problem because I'm a big fan of it. And so I'll introduce it. I'll just briefly state the problem for the audience. So in the standard Newcomb problem, you're in a room faced with 2 boxes. One is opaque, one is transparent. The opaque box either contains nothing, no money, or $1 million, and although you don't know which. And the transparent one contains $1,000, and that's known to you. And now you can choose to take the contents either of both boxes, 2 boxing, or of just the opaque one boxing. There's one important caveat, which is that there was this like wise oracle or whatever that made some prediction regarding which option you would take before now. Maybe it made it a week ago. It doesn't really matter. And it's 95% accurate when it makes these sorts of predictions. And then you expect that to be relevant to your prediction now. And if it predicted that you would take both boxes, there would be 2 boxes, it placed nothing in the opaque box. And if it predicted that you would 1 box, like take only the opaque box, it placed $1 million in the opaque box. And then the question is, well, what should you do now? Is it better to take just the 1 box or to take both? And there's the longstanding sort of dispute has been like, well, it looks like there's motivations for each. And then we get different decision rules and different values and decision making and so on. Anyway, I just, before I get to a sort of variation on this, I wonder what roughly you think about this problem. Like, I mean, what would you do in the Newcomb situation?
Okay, so the Newcomb case, so I had Isaac Levi as my thesis advisor and had many discussions with Isaac about these kinds of problems. First thing I want to do is, let me just point out that the way the problem is set up and its connection with what we were talking about a moment ago, it looks like choosing 2 boxes simply dominates choosing 1 box if the states are opaque box full, opaque box empty. Of course, whatever's in the opaque box, you get more by choosing two boxes than one box. That's the way I understood the problem was setting up. And so the question is, under what conditions do you want to overturn dominance if you're recommending one box? So to recommend one box requires overturning dominance in the setting. So the theme we were just talking about is that dominance doesn't obtain if there's moral hazard, that is, act state dependence. And the question now, and this is a point Isaac made yet many years ago, is what's your conditional probability for the opaque box being full? Say that's the first column. Opaque box has the money in it. Second column, opaque box does not. What's your conditional probability for the opaque box being full, given that you choose one box rather than you choose two boxes? If it's the same, there's no moral hazard. You'll have dominance and you'll choose two boxes. So if there's to be any sort of dispute here, we need to fill in the details of the problem in such a way that the agent is reasonably assigning different probabilities to the opaque box being full, given choosing one box, than if empty. And if we want to make the problem credible, I'd say, well, I'm not going to just take your word about the quality of this predictor. I want to have some evidence that the predictor is good. And so I'll want to see a history of choices of both kinds, people choosing one box, people choosing two boxes. And what you told me about the way the predictor is accurate, which is normally accuracy would be, given that the predictor puts one box in, the probability is high that the agent chooses one box, and so on. That doesn't determine the conditional probabilities I was asking about. The conditional probabilities I was asking about reverses. It's not the probability that the box is full or empty, given that the predictor behaved in a certain way. It's the probability that the box is full or empty, given that I've chosen in a certain way. And so I would need, in order to overturn dominance, I would need to believe that the probability that box is full, given that I chose one box, is high, and the probability that the closed box is empty is full, given that I chose is empty, given that I chose two boxes, is high. That is, I need to have that kind of moral hazard. And to begin with, the problem, I think, trades on the model of accuracy you were describing, which is the probabilities given what the predictor is doing. And those are conditional probabilities with the terms reversed. And so it can be high one way and low the other. So we need to make sure that we're telling the story in a way that it's reasonable to believe the probability is high that the box is full, given that I chose one box, and the probability is low that it's full, given that I've chosen two boxes. And that already is enough, I think, to relegate this situation to a bit of a never land, because under what circumstances am I going to believe that? We can follow it through, but I'm saying that we're now not in a case of an ordinary predictor. We have to have someone where the conditional probabilities are high and low in accord with that moral hazard decision problem. Now we can proceed that way, but I just want to point out, and this was Isaac's point many years ago, that the story which makes prediction credible does not yet provide us with sufficient reason for moral hazard of the kind that's needed to overturn dominance. So I can think the predictor is very good and still want to choose two boxes and maximize conditional expected utility. It depends on how the moral hazard sets up. So do you want us to continue with the situation where the conditional probability is high, that I think the box is full if I choose one box and is empty if I choose two boxes? I mean, that's what's needed if we're going to have any dispute here. If we don't have that, we don't have any dispute. Everyone's choosing two boxes because dominance applies.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we can continue under that assumption, but I mean, it wouldn't take much to be able to derive that, right? I mean, from
But the point is that's what we need to derive.
Right.
And if we have that, then okay, let's proceed.
Okay. Yeah.
So let's suppose now, and I assume these probabilities are reasonable so that everyone in the community agrees that if I choose one box, the conditional probability that the box is full is high. And if I choose two boxes, the conditional probability is high that the closed box is empty. Well, if that's the case, and I know that that's the opinion of everyone in the audience, then I'll say, assuming ownership of my decision is transferable, if I choose one box, can't I auction it off for a lot of money? Suppose I choose one box. I have ownership. Whoever has this ticket now has ownership to the contents of the one box. What should the fair market value be for this ticket?
Well, so wait. So let me understand that let me make sure that I'm understanding this. Are we supposing that you first pick the one box, don't open it, and sell it?
I have a choice of which way to go. I can pick one box or I can pick two boxes.
Right.
But I'm saying we're also assuming that the conditional probability is high, that if I pick one box, the probability is high that the closed box has a lot of money in it. And if I pick two boxes, the conditional probability is high that the closed box has no money in it. And everyone agrees with me on this because the evidence is for why we have this is sort of the track record of the predictor and other people choosing. If that's the case, when I choose one box before I open it, if that's a transferable ownership, having chosen that, the owner of the ticket gets the reward of what the ticket gives you. The tickets can say I'm opening two boxes or I'm only opening the closed box. My understanding is at that point, everyone agrees that the probability is high that the closed box has got a lot of money in it. And so the value of that ticket is very much the value of what goes in the closed box when the predictor predicts I'll choose only one box. A lot of money.
Right.
The value of that ticket, the market value of that ticket should be very high, much higher than the market value of the ticket if I were to choose two boxes.
Right. Yeah. So the point is that it's assuming that it's 95% likely that to contain a million if you a conditional on you choosing one box, then
and 95% that it's empty if I choose two boxes.
Right. Then the sort of
and the point is everyone's supposed to, the evidence here is not merely a subjective judgment. I'm not making this up on a whim. This is some reported track record of the performance of people choosing these boxes, making this decision with the demon. In which case, I don't understand why the market value of choosing one box isn't much higher than the market value of choosing two boxes.
Right. So I agree with this. We would say in the original case, the expected monetary value of that one box, and you could transfer it and so on, is 950,000. And the expected monetary value of both boxes, assuming 95%, the conditional probability here is, I think it was like 51,000 or whatever it is.
Yes.
50,000 plus 1,000. And well, it's clearly 950,000 much greater than 51,000. So that's
if other people have the same conditional probabilities, that should be the market value of that ticket.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I don't understand what the conditional probabilities are reporting.
That's fair, but people will say different things. Like one thing that people say is that,
of course they will.
They'll say that but it doesn't. Whatever you want to say about these market values, there's some fact about how much money is in the boxes total, and whatever that is, you get $1,000 more if you take both of them than if you take one.
Well, we're back to the dominance argument. That's what you just reported. And I'm saying we know that there are conditions under which dominance doesn't apply. Moral hazard is them. And are we prepared to adopt the conditional probabilities that go along with moral hazard? I agree with you. If you're not willing to adopt those conditional probabilities, you think there's no moral hazard here, the contents of the box or whatever they are, and you reason that way, then there's no moral hazard and dominance applies. But that's why I went through the point I learned from Isaac, which is that you have to be clear about which conditional probabilities are high or low in order to challenge moral hazard. It's not enough that the predictor be accurate. It's got to be that the conditional probabilities given your actions are the way we described, which is a different claim than the ordinary claim that the predictor is accurate. I mean, the predictor could be accurate, for example, if the predictor always predicts that you're not choosing, leaves the boxes empty. People see that, and even when you choose one box, the box is empty. The overall accuracy of the predictor is still very high if people learn that there's never any money in the closed box, but you don't have any moral hazard in that case.
Right. I mean, so I could see people pushing back then on the claims here about moral hazard, because I mean, the relevant fact is that there's, with moral hazard, is that there is this act state dependence, right?
State dependence.
But
right.
So some people could say that there's only a case for moral hazard, or what they might supplant it with, if there's act state sort of causal dependence rather than just dependence.
Yes, fine, we can go back and do that, but then you're going to say the conditional probability is not high that there is money in the closed box, given that I choose one box.
Well, but what if they grant that it is high, but that's just
well, then I'm asking, if it's high, are you gonna say its value is not its expected monetary value from that probability? What's the meaning of that high probability, conditional probability, if it's not action guiding?
That's a fair question, but I think I want to say that their decision rule they adopt that takes seriously this sort of causal structure and might even ignore some of these, probabilistic relations, is well, that's just what they're using to guide this.
Yeah, so I'm saying that it seems to me that for them the conditional probability is not high, and for them there's no moral hazard. I mean, they're calling it conditional causal probability, but that's the only one they'll allow in that case. The other conditional probability is in name only. It doesn't guide any action.
Right. It wouldn't guide the action unless there's this associating. Well, the thing that really matters is the causal connection.
So there isn't. I mean, either there is or there isn't moral hazard, which has to do with whether the conditional probabilities I assign guide my actions to violate dominance or not. And if the only conditional probabilities they'll assign in this case are ones where you support dominance, then there's no moral hazard. I don't understand. I mean, I'm back to thinking this is not a very serious issue, because they want to argue that the correct statistical analysis of the example is to use what they call the causal conditional probabilities. I know what those are. There'll be no moral hazard. And so the fact that the demon is said to be predictively accurate on one set of conditions doesn't entail the reverse conditional probabilities, Isaac's old point. And you're saying, I don't want to buy the high conditional probabilities the other way when they're based on conditioning on the act. You're calling it causal conditional, but it functions just like a conditional probability. And you're saying there's no moral hazard here. If there's no moral hazard, we choose two boxes by dominance.
Right. So I'm on the same page. I'm just trying to give opposing.
Yeah, I understand you're trying.
Because I don't know.
But I don't see. I guess I'm not at this point. I'm not getting excited about the Newcomb problem the way it's supposed to get you excited. And I'm saying it seems to me that if someone wants, I mean, there's coherent conditional probabilities that associate with no moral hazard. I'm not saying that's incoherent. I think it's a bit strange if I saw patterns of choices. I mean, I could well imagine patterns of choices where I would think the reasonable thing to do is to admit the moral hazard with the usual intended conditional probabilities that it's high, that there's money in the closed box if I choose one box, and low if I choose two boxes. But that's going to introduce moral hazard, which the advocates of causal decision theory say are inappropriate. They're going to reason from the statistics. I'd like to see how they reason from the statistics in that case.
Right. Yeah, it's tricky because, I don't know. I'll move on from this in a second, but often.
Well, I think there is an issue here which does come up against a traditional philosophic problem, which is in what sense do I take myself to be a free agent in a decision problem? and I control my actions. And that starts to get awkward if I know too much about myself, including how I make decisions. This is a Fred Schick point. Fred Schick was a philosopher at Rutgers. By the way, both Fred and Isaac were students at Columbia under Ernest Nagel. So there's a common cause there. Fred pointed out a version of the old free will problem, which is that if I know I'm an expected utility maximizer and I know my probabilities and utilities, then in what sense, when I introduce a decision, am I free in that context? Because I can identify what I'm going to choose even before I do any expected utility analysis. In what sense could I choose the other? Not under the current situation. So there's a problem here about how much self-knowledge is consistent with calling this a decision problem, given the assumptions of a decision problem is that I view myself free. I think we can start to bump up against that in the Newcomb case, in which case maybe the right way to describe the problem is to say, when you give me all the information, which also includes the causal story that would like, maybe it's right to say decision theory is just inappropriate in this case because I can't reconcile the judgment of a free choice with the assumptions that you've given me.
Right. Yeah. I've heard people say similar things, at least in the sort of limiting case where the predictor is like infallible, like that might maybe.
Yeah, right. But I'm saying, but I don't think there's going to be much daylight between epsilon and zero, you know.
Yeah. And then also what you said reminded me of something that comes up in different cases about this whole like deliberation crowds out prediction thesis.
Yes, that's Isaac. Yeah,
right.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Isaac wanted to acknowledge that he did acknowledge this tension. I mean, he and Fred were good friends, and so Isaac's resolution of this is to carve out more space for decision theory by diminishing the circumstances under which the predictions are accepted. So Isaac, I think, tried the safety valve of saying, well, I don't know for sure I'm an expected utility maximizer. So even though when I'm deciding I know my probabilities and utilities, when I'm thinking of it as decision, I haven't yet imposed upon me the norm of maximizing expected utility. That's a legal way out. I think maybe the better way out is say, if I have all that information I've accepted, I can no longer view this as a decision.
Yeah. So there's definitely some interesting things there about like what's the minimum requirements for this counting as a genuine decision problem and so on.
That's right. Yeah.
I tend to be a bit more permissive there. Like I think that like, even if you view things as like deterministic or in other words, so long as you have some you have a preference function over outcomes, and you at least take yourself to be considering multiple options. And there's like
what is considering yourself to be? But what is considering yourself to be taking multiple options require? Does it require knowing?
They're epistemically open, I guess.
Yeah, they're epistemical, but that's what the worry is. The epistemic closure of here are my probabilities, here are my utilities. I'm an expected utility maximizer. The epistemic closure of that is very constraining. Anything that doesn't maximize expected utility is no longer an option.
Right. Okay. Yes. Yeah. I see what you're saying there.
This is Fred's old point, Schick's old point, that if you know too much about yourself, you can deprive yourself of the opportunity to have a choice.
Right. Okay. I did want to cover one more thing, maybe in favor of a kind of causalist approach, is that they'll say things like, look, decision theory should be concerned with coming up with and following decision rules which enable you to causally promote the most good, right, or the best good, or whatever, and it could turn out that the actions that you could take which correlate with the best good are not the same as the actions you could take which causally promote the best good. And the Newcomb problem is maybe a case which violates that. Yes, it's true that you're taking $1 correlates with the most money received, but nevertheless, you taking $1 does not causally promote you to have the most money, whereas taking both boxes does. something like that. Though filling in the details can be a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to wind up just coloring the same situations with different words. I'm not seeing. Look, again, I don't think it's incoherent to be a two-boxer. It's just that it's incoherent to be a two-boxer and admit moral hazard of the kind the problem is meant to afford. Now, you know, I don't think I'm going to be saying much different than that in content, no matter how we color the options and the consequences.
Okay, right. Yeah, I'm on the same page. I'm definitely granting this assumption about the conditional probability of the money or the prediction based on a conditional on your choice. Now, granting that that's high, yeah, one boxing just seems like the obvious answer. If it's not high, then sure, yeah, to take two boxes. But
Right.
Anyway, I did want to give a bit of a variation on Newcomb's problem, and then maybe this is relevant coming back to the ignorance is bliss thing. Although I can already,
Sure.
I think I already know what you're going to say, but I'll give it anyway. So that's.
I'll pretend you don't know, so I'll think I have a free choice about how to reason through it.
Right. So this is a variation of Newcomb's, which turns it into a sequential problem, where first you get the choice to pay a fee. It doesn't really matter what the fee is, a fairly small, whatever, to observe the contents of the opaque box, right? So if you pay this fee, you get to observe what's in the opaque box, be it a million or nothing. And then after that, and you know this ahead of time, you'll get the choice of taking both boxes or just one.
Well, let me just make sure I'm understanding.
Yeah.
It seems to me that if I've seen what's in the box, then given that information, there's no longer any moral hazard,
Right.
because what's in the box is fixed and determined in a way I already know.
Correct.
And so choosing one box or choosing two boxes doesn't change my probability for what's in the box. So if I look in the box, I'm going to take both boxes.
Correct. Right. However, you might think that there's a reason not to take the information, i.e., there's a reason to pay the fee to not look into the opaque box, which is that.
Yeah, I think now the demon's going to be predicting whether I look in the box or not.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean,
because if the demon predicts I'm going to look in the box, then the demon knows that I no longer have any moral hazard in the circumstance where I've looked in the box, and I'll choose two boxes. So if the demon predicts I'll look in the box, there's no money in the box.
Yeah, effectively. I mean, I think, could we still set it up where the demon doesn't know about the first part? It's just able to predict, regardless whether you look into the box, it's able to predict whether you take both.
But that's the point. I may behave differently whether I look in the box or not, so it can't predict independently of the demon knows enough about my reasoning to know that if I look in the box, moral hazard goes away, and I choose two boxes.
Right. I mean, if the demon knows more about how you're reasoning and so on, and the situation, it can predict that. Well, if it predicts that you're going to take both boxes, and probably
Right.
you looked in the box, but I mean, does that make a difference here? I mean, yeah.
I'm not seeing what the problem is. I mean, again, I would much prefer we were talking about some real world cases, so I could see what the real issues are. But to the extent that I can follow this hypothetical, we've agreed that if I'm allowed to look in the box, and the rules of the game are the box can't change after I've looked in it, then having looked in the box, there's no moral hazard. I choose two boxes, regardless what I would do if I didn't look in the box.
Right. But then the question is
the option to look in the box removes the moral hazard and the value of the information. If it were predicted if the demon could predict that I was looking in the box, the demon will know I choose two boxes, and the rules of the game are that the demon then leaves that box empty. And so if I look in the box will be empty. Or very high probability.
So then there is a kind of a hazard to looking in the box.
That's right. Looking in the box is like a case. I mean, if I'm prepared to do the one boxer conditional probabilities without looking in the box, then looking in the box as a further option creates another layer of moral hazard.
Right. Yeah. So then it
Because
would be rational to pay some fee, you know, assuming it's not too large.
not to look in the box.
Right. But again, this is another case where you don't have
Yeah, I
back
mean,
state independence.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so we've embedded the moral hazard in the Newcomb problem in a slightly different way by this opportunity to pay to observe what's in the box. I think what we agree is that when you observe what's in the box, given what the nature of observation is, the moral hazard goes away, and everybody would say the expected utility of choosing two boxes, given that you looked in the box, is whatever is in the box plus $1,000.
Right.
How this affects the Newcomb predictor, we have to go back and work out. But I assume the Newcomb predictor understands that if I look in the box, moral hazard goes away for choosing, and I choose the dominant action.
Right. Yeah. No. That all seems right to me. I mean, I'm definitely on the same page here. I think paying the fee, given the assumptions we've let out, is rational. So I mean, okay. So coming back to, we've talked about Newcombs and I guess some other cases which do violate act state independence. What do you think? Do you have any examples of at least alleged cases where act state independence is not violated, but it's still it's a single actor case, not like two or more, where it's arguably rational to pay to avoid cost for information?
Okay, so there are other mathematical components of goods argument which don't depend on moral hazard or cost-free information. But now we're into some of the more subtle issues of mathematical probability having to do with infinity. So one place where you can cause a negative value of information, that is, the theorem does not hold, is if you're into infinities where the state space, what might be going on, is not a finite partition, and you would introduce what are called merely finitely additive probabilities that are not countably additive if it's a countable partition. And here, again, you can have a situation where initially A is better than B, but no matter what you see, an update by conditioning, and the conditioning can be non-controversial conditioning, no zeros in the event you're conditioning on, the conditional probability value of A drops below B. So right now, my unconditional expectation for A is greater than B, but given every element of the partition, which is the experiment, no matter what I see, my conditional probability for A will drop below B. That is possible without countable additivity. That is, if you violate countable additivity. So now we're into debates about the mathematics of probability in settings of infinity. And I think we're long beyond any intuitions. It's a question of how the mathematics works and what the benefit loss is for one mathematical framework of probability over another. If you adopt if you make it merely finitely additive probability with infinite experiments, then the good result no longer is valid, even when there's no moral hazard, even when the information is cost-free. So Good's result depends on, I think he formulates it for a finite partition, so the issue of the infinity doesn't arise. But if you wanted to extend it to experiments where the model of the sample space is infinite, now you're into a further mathematical assumption about countable additivity. Without it, the theorem can reverse even when there's no moral hazard and no cost of looking.
Right. Yeah. Okay, good.
I don't know if that's the direction that's another direction we'll explore.
Right. Yeah, I remember this.
So now that's grist for the debate about whether probability should be finite or more countably additive in the infinite setting.
Right.
Because clearly the price, the intellectual price, if you allow me that pun, on allowing the liberality of the finite additivity, which is not countably additive, is to create further counterexamples to the value of information result. And you might want to say, notice Toland's for you finitely additive. You don't want that to happen. So that shows there's a defect in the theory that permits these finitely additive, not countably additive probabilities, because they encourage a refutation of the value of information result, even though there's no moral hazard, even though the information is cost free.
Okay, good. Yeah, I was wondering, some of what you said reminded me of a quote unquote statistical paradox, the Simpson's paradox. And I was wondering, I mean, this is obviously a finite case. Are you familiar?
Yeah, Simpson's paradox is a different issue.
Right.
I think I don't think it admits a simple account. This has to do with the fact that an unconditional probability, which is an average of conditionals, the Simpson's paradox is that without doing a bit of mathematics, I don't know how to do this walking in the woods as Helmholtz would require. So I don't understand it at that level of depth. But I could explain to you that the problem here is that in Simpson's paradox, where you have basically a binary partition in two subpopulations, and you can say, for example, treatment A is better. Treatment A was better than treatment B amongst the men, and treatment A was better than treatment B amongst the women, but unconditionally treatment B is better than treatment A. That can arise when there's correlation between the size of the partition for the men and the women and with treatment. We don't have them equally treated.
Right.
And this can arise in finite partitions. It just has to do with the fact that conditional probabilities, when they're associated with frequencies, will not average out to the unconditional probability when the sample sizes are unequal in the two subpopulations you're sampling.
Right.
That's one of the reasons. It's one of the reasons why statisticians, when they design experiments, have an interest in equal sample sizes under the different arms of treatments. You want same number under A as in B as C, where A, B, and C are treatments. That's one way of blocking this kind of, quote, paradox. I mean, the paradox is not a contradiction. It just that you want the conditional frequencies to reflect conditional probabilities. And when the frequencies are based on unequal sample sizes of treatments, that assumption is a weighty one.
Right. Yeah, the connection I was drawing, and maybe it's not really relevant, let me know, but was that, like, suppose you were, I mean, you're told that you have somebody from the population that, and you're asking, well, maybe it's relevant to some decision you're making. Well, if you're doing some example with the treatment or whatever, you're considering whether the likelihood that they have the disease, and maybe you're acting based on that. It could be that in the situation is like a Simpsons paradox situation, where if you learned which sort of subgroup the person was a part of, regardless of what you learned, that would change your opinion about whether they had disease or whatnot. So, I mean, maybe this is something like that, where like this information is going to change.
Well,
Yeah.
again, the Simpsons paradox is a case in which there's a correlation between which treatment you get and the effectiveness of the treatment. And the correlation is borne out by the fact that you have unequal numbers of the subpopulation, of the two subpopulations, men and women, reflected in the treatment and the control groups. And of course, I mean, to use an extreme case, if you had only treated one male and that male had succeeded in recovering, then the frequency of success amongst the males treated is one that's going to be higher than what you're going to see amongst the women, assuming it's not a perfect treatment for women. Yet, and then under the untreated, the men might do better than the women, but overall, the men might do just a little bit better than the women under the untreatment. But if the women are really doing much better than the average male, then you want to treat. The reason you didn't is because you said that the treatment was better amongst the men than women based on a sample of size 1 of men, one man who got treated and recovered, and not all the women did. But if the recovery of the women is very high, like 95%, and that is reflective of the conditional probability. then you could see why you don't want to reason from the case space frequencies, because the sample design was very poor. The experimental design was poor, and the unequal treatment sizes is what's setting up the Simpson's paradox, because you're treating the frequencies in the samples as reflective of the conditional probabilities, and that's not going to be reasonable in this case when you've only got one male treated.
Right. Okay. So then just going back then, for the cases which do satisfy Good's assumptions, then the ways, the circumstances in which it might count as rational to pay to avoid costly information. One is if countable additivity is violated, and then is there anything else? Is there other like
accountable additivity? We have moral hazard.
Right.
We have cost-free information. I mean, go through the examples we discussed. The taxi driver, I think that would be cost-free information violating. You've got a moral hazard, which we've already talked about. You've got countable additivity. The Simpson is just a poor piece of statistics in going from frequencies in which you've tested one male and the male recovered to saying the conditional probability of recovery amongst men is higher than amongst women, assuming only 95% of a large sample of women recovered. That would be the silly move there. That's just bad statistical inference.
Right. Okay. Yeah. That seems really good. All right. I mean, we spent a lot of time on this. I want to cover some other things if that's all right.
Sure. Yes. But but you wove many interesting topics in here. In particular, you elicited from me my lack of two boxing in the case of the extreme version of the Newcomb problem. But as I say, I'm not enthralled with the problem because I don't see where the circumstances arise in practice that make it a serious problem.
Right.
It's a philosophic problem for me at the end about how much self-knowledge you can have and still call it a decision.
Right. Yeah, I don't think it's, I mean, maybe there's some real world examples. I mean, given that the predictor doesn't have to be that reliable and the, then the probabilities the other way don't have to be that reliable. You know what I mean? It could be that realizable in everyday life.
So I think where this starts to press on formal theories is, are you willing when you're making a decision to put probabilities on your own choices? And that's, I think, another symptom of this problem. I don't think it's reasonable to have probabilities on your own options when you're trying to formulate the problem as a decision problem. You don't get that in most of the usual decision problems reserve probabilities for states and not probabilities for your own options at the point. I'm not talking about a mixed option. That's different. But thinking about the options as having probabilities over them as things you're trying to choose, I think that's another problem in trying to make the mathematics do too much. I don't see how to reconcile that with it being a choice.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. So yeah, another thing I wanted to cover. So it's actually sort of connected because you've talked about this sort of briefly already. You've talked about like the rationality of group decisions, and like one thing I had to look at was this paper from a while ago with Joseph Cadane and Mark Shervish on like shared preferences of two Bayesian decision makers. And so like, I mean, the more general issue is like concerns how to treat, or if we even can treat like the decision making of a group per se of two or maybe more individuals. Well, we could have different assumptions about what those individuals are like, but in particular, if they're like Bayesian decision makers with their own kind of preferences and utilities. And one important result that you argue is that it's not going to be some like good compromise solution. Anyway, could you talk a bit about this problem and the upshot of this conclusion?
So let me provide a little bit of the backdrop for this. I think when you look at the history of what was going on, say in the 1950s, starting with Arrow and Arrow's impossibility theorem for social choice, and then you look at a book which comes out a little bit later, Jimmy Savage's book on foundations of statistics, you start to see pressure on the view that groups, cooperative groups even, can be held up to the same standards of rationality as individuals. For example, I mean, this is maybe the less familiar line of those two. Savage acknowledges that though he titles his book The Foundations of Statistics, and the statistics he's trying to give foundations are the statistics he learned with, which culminates, say, in Abraham Wald's work, but Neyman Pearce and Abraham Wald, that line of statistics is getting less and less defense from his theory as the theory evolves in the book. And he's saying, why am I calling this the foundation of statistics when it's clear the decision theory I'm giving is not going to be decision theory for the statistics I've been taught? And as you move through the book, as you get past the formulation of the Bayesian theory he gives, and he starts to talk about contemporary statistics of his day, which he's realizing he's not giving a foundations for, he starts to shift over to talking about statistics for groups and theorems that might be appropriate for groups which are not appropriate for individuals. What do I mean here? Well, the Bayesian theory that he's going to advocate is, at the end of the day, if you have to summarize it in a single rule, it's maximize expected utility. And if you look and see where the tensions are with the kinds of statistics he's developing, the contemporary statistics of his day still have vestiges of a kind of security or guarantee result, worst case analysis. And Savage is suggesting, well, maybe that's kind of reasoning, that worst case analysis has some place in group decision making as part of compromise decision making, which his theory is not leaving much room for. So his theory would, I think, point in the direction of, well, individuals are supposed to maximize expected utility. There's not much room for security reasoning with individuals. But when you get to groups, maybe the groups can defend a compromise which brings out security, worst case reasoning, guaranteeing something for someone in the group or something like that. And that would underscore this division between individual rationality and even cooperative group rationality. We took that to a stronger conflict in the 89 paper, because we're saying, even if you're not looking for security reasoning and all you want the group to do is maximize expected utility, then even under that framework, there's a tension between individuals and the cooperative group they're composed of, in the sense that if the individuals don't have identical probabilities don't have identical utilities, make a case of two. Dick and Jane, we call this. So Dick and Jane are trying to form a partnership where the partnership's going to behave like a savage expected utility maximizer to the outside world. And the only constraint that you want to impose, which is not a security constraint, but is a unanimity constraint, which is that if both Dick and Jane find option A better than option B, you want the group to preserve that, then that's already enough to drive a wedge between group cooperative decision-making and Bayesian theory, because the result we have is that in that case, if Dick and Jane disagree on both probabilities to some degree on some event, they assign different probabilities and don't have the same cardinal utility, then the unanimity or Pareto rule will prevent any Bayesian compromise. The only Bayesian models for what they have shared agreements on is to make one or the other the autocrat. There are only two Bayesian models. So there's no room for compromise. So that example suggests to me, or that theorem, the class of examples it covers, suggests to me that there really is a problem from a Bayes point of view trying to create Bayesian models of cooperative decision. You've got to relax something in the Savage framework, even without already imposing a condition of security, which is, I think, what Savage is suggesting as a kind of minimax regret rule that he's looking to explain what groups are doing. So we were trying to heighten the tension on Savage's program then by saying that it's not that the group rule is appealing to security reasoning, that the tension. There's already a fundamental problem in trying to extend the Bayesian framework from the single agent to the cooperative group agent subject to a unanimity rule. And so we started to look for decision theories that captured as much of the Bayesian theory as we could, but would generalize through to groups. And we wound up looking at decision theories which use sets of probabilities and utilities and unanimity. And then the individual is not required to have a single probability either, because we're saying it's the same model for a group as a cooperative group. And so we say there's the sense of uncertainty that comes with sets of probabilities that can be used for an individual. And this should be allowed, as rational individuals don't have to resolve their uncertainty to the point of being a savage Bayesian. You can be an indeterminate Bayesian with sets of probabilities. And that's the way we get out of it. Does that tell enough of a story to put a frame on that kind of problem?
Yeah, no, that's great. So yeah, and again, it's like interesting that like from relatively few assumptions for this sort of decision theory, you already get that you can't get this sort of compromise from.
Yes, that is from Arrow. The comparison with Arrow is Arrow uses this no interpersonal utility comparisons, which is a very heavy duty assumption and is one that economists like to walk away from. And then there are many solutions to Arrow's problem if you build in interpersonal utility comparisons. The result I was reporting doesn't depend on that at all. You can have interpersonal utility comparisons or not. The result is only a Pareto or a unanimity condition that's required, which is one of Arrow's conditions. That's enough to cause the impossibility for Bayesians. You don't need the heavyweight, no interpersonal utility comparisons. So in that sense, I think the problem is worse for Bayesians than for non-Bayesians. And given that there's a lot of Bayesian statistics, which I think makes sense, the question is, how do you hold on to that and still have a theory that works for cooperating groups? And I think the account that you'll find pursued in work with Mark and Jay is that we use sets of probabilities. They're incomplete preference structures.
Yeah, and what's the relation between this incomplete preference structures and just like, I don't know, like imprecise probabilities or imprecise credences?
Yes, so imprecise probabilities, there are many mathematical models under imprecise probabilities, but one that is commonplace is to see that the imprecise probabilities arise from having sets of probabilities reflecting the judgments. And so that could be thought of as a committee of savage type Bayesians trying to work together. But the only thing that is operative is the Pareto unanimity condition, and then the group cannot be a Bayesian by the result, but the group can be an imprecise Bayesian. So one interpretation for the imprecise probability is whatever your agent is, think of your agent as if it was composed of a set of these savage style Bayesians. But you don't have to be a savage style Bayesian to be a rational individual. You can see yourself as being one of these group agents yourself.
Yeah. So I definitely see this, right? So even if each of the individuals that make up the group are like savage Bayesians, they do have precise probabilities and so on. If we're not requiring for an agent, quote unquote, facing a decision problem that they have precise probabilities, then it could be the group has imprecise probabilities, and,
Yes.
and you can model that in
That's
terms
right.
of sets of probabilities. Yeah,
that's right.
Right.
And in fact, one of the ways of taking advantage of that in connection with statistics is you can see the group of precise Bayesians as being a kind of robustness test. I would like to vary my probability in a certain way. So I'm looking at not one probability, but a family of probabilities. And I'd like my result to have nice unanimity results or robustness results over this variation by the group opinion. That is, it might be that I want the distribution to be symmetric, but I don't have a fixed variance. So I might want to allow I might want to allow, say, normal distributions with a common mean, but with different variances. And then you've got so you can say I would like to introduce a level of uncertainty, unresolved uncertainty about aspects of a statistical model, and represent that with a set of opinions, set of precise opinions. And that's a way of seeing the imprecise probability as tied to robustness studies in statistics, which are quite common. I mean, there's a legitimate subdiscipline in statistics called robust statistics. Peter Huber, very famous in getting that off the ground, where you're looking to show that a certain decision is defensible, not because it's best in every case, but because it maintains a high standing as being a good decision, maybe not the best decision, under each of a wide variety of different probability details. For example, let me just give you a quick example. This would come right out of Peter Huber. If you're dealing with normal data and you know the data are normal and you're worried about the mean of the distribution, the center of the distribution, then averages are very good statistics for summarizing the data and for basing predictions on. However, if the data may not be normal and you're worried about some outlier, maybe some one observation is driven by it results from a mistake in the machine operating at that point, and the machine can generate extreme values every so often. So you no longer have normal distributions. Most of the time it's normal, but epsilon times you can get something weird because the machine breaks down, in which case, rather than using the sample average, the sample median is robust in the sense that it will not change or hardly ever change, depending on whether your data are from the intended normal model or coming from this occasionally this weird observation. When you look at the overall sample median, that's not going to shift much, maybe by one observation in your data. When the median jumps to an extreme, when the observation jumps to an extreme, but the sample averages, can be shifted arbitrarily by moving one observation, no matter what your sample size. You give me a big jump, and so the sample average is unstable that way. And so if I'm uncertain as to whether my data are generated by a normal or this contaminated normal, where with probability epsilon I get something weird, the median is a robust statistic for making decisions where the sample average is not. If I knew it was normal, then the sample average would be doing better by a fixed amount than the median. But when I don't know it's normal, the sample average can have some really bad cases. This is a kind of worst case analysis, which the median avoids. And so deciding with imprecise probabilities where I watch out also for worst case circumstances would favor the median over the mean. And that's a way of endorsing robust statistics from an imprecise probability point of view, where I'm trying to find a decision which may not always be optimal, but on the other hand is pretty good and avoid certain pitfalls that trying to be optimal will expose me to.
Good. Yeah, so a lot there. I mean, I did have a few things I wanted to ask about this. So, yeah, first of all, we talked a lot about having these imprecise credences. What about imprecise preferences? I mean, is that also covered here?
Yeah, so imprecise credences with even a precise utility will generate imprecise expected utilities. And so if the preferences are given by expected utilities, they will display the kind of incompleteness that the credences are introducing. And so the question is, what kind of decision rule do you want to use when options are assigned not a single expected utility, but a set? And now the question is, how do you want to decide? I tend to favor decision rules like the kind that Isaac Levi introduced, which are more Bayesian, which is to say, I want a decision that at least has some Bayes model. That is, I can show it's best for some probability in my set. And there are reasons for wanting to do that relating to dominance. But that requires comparing options in more than two at a time. You won't be able to locate the Bayes solutions that way by just doing binary comparisons. So the cost of doing that, trying to use a Bayes type decision rule with a set of probabilities where option A is allowed if it maximizes expected utility for at least one probability in my set. The price for doing that is I can't reduce my decision rule to binary comparisons. I need to look at an option may be unacceptable by that rule, but its unacceptability is not revealed by binary comparisons, because it'll be best in some binary comparisons, but not best when I'm looking across three options at a time. It's never best amongst the three, but it's always best when I consider it, it's sometimes best when I consider it in comparison with any other single one. So the price for that is to move away from binary comparisons, which is hard if you're doing economic work, because you get what the person chose, and you don't get to see all the things the person rejected. So you don't know the full menu. It's harder to do economic analysis with that kind of Bayes decision rule. You need a lot of rich data to find out what's going on.
Yeah, because he's someone having a worry about the sort of maybe not the possibility, but the rationality of having imprecise credences. You might say, well, it's always going to be rational to have a credence which, I don't know, maybe it's like the mean of an imprecise range or something like that. And so, like the rational agent, be it an individual or group, would not have an imprecise credence. I mean, what do you think of this sort of concern?
Back to the example what we started with. If I have two agents and they're Bayesians, and then they try and find a precise resolution to their disagreements, which is also Bayesian, then they will be giving up some unanimity to do that. They won't be able to say, we both like A over B, but the group chooses A. They'll have to say, we both like A over B, but the group chooses B. It seems to me I don't want to entertain that. So that would mean the group would not be able to find a precise resolution.
But then, I mean, it could be just a conclusion that I could see someone drawing is that, yeah, okay, a rational agent would have precise probabilities. There's just no way to treat appropriately this sort of group as a rational agent. And that's kind of it. You know, maybe you can say these other things.
Okay, but why can't the individual allow the same more generous account of uncertainty that you're allowing to the group? Why is it irrational for an individual to say, I would like the same flexibility in treating uncertainty that you're permitting a group?
I guess the point would be that you could treat the individual or the group that way. It's just that insofar as they are being treated that way or are acting that way, they're not acting like a rational agent or something like that, or a perfectly rational agent. Yeah.
I mean, we're back, I think, where we started. If you want the Savage style model of perfect rationality, then cooperative groups cannot be perfectly rational. And it seems to me we want a theory of rationality in which cooperative groups can be perfectly rational. So if you want the adjective perfectly there,
yeah.
I would want to extend that notion of perfection to individuals as well as groups.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair. And then another thing is that, okay, you give this particular model, this particular approach for thinking in terms of sets of probabilities and so on for individuals and groups. But I mean, I could imagine, there's going to be other ways to reject the kind of Savage way of thinking about things, but also get the same sort of desired result where you can treat without doing exactly what you're doing. And I wonder, like,
yes, that's right.
Is there?
So now I think it becomes we're now down in the battle of in the trenches. Now it's going to depend on what the particular rival looks like. What I think the trade-off you're going to have to face is. So I mean, to use an example which I've used and gets us back to the value of information result. So it turns out that the value of information result does not reduce to binary comparisons. That's a short way of reporting a long result. But it means that if I'm trying to do imprecise probabilities And here's a kind of rival theory that I would use this against. And I want to explore opportunities for sets of probabilities which are not so simple as being convex. That means the averages of distributions are in the set. I would like the uncertainty to be represented by sets of probabilities, but not pretty convex sets. Convex sets being sets that are closed under average. Why would I want to avoid being committed to using only convex sets? Well, let me give you a value of information type argument. I can, and this relates to well, it's hard for me to pinpoint the feature that goods result. We can come back to it, but it doesn't deal with the ones we've discussed so far. Is that suppose I've got two doctors as our two, instead of Dick and Jane, I've got two doctors, and the doctors are concerned about a patient's allergic reaction to treatment A versus not A. And they have differences of opinions about the agent on this. I can bring in an irrelevancy. They both agree that the weather in Beijing today is irrelevant to the state of this patient's allergic status. But they have different opinions about that too. So you've got two doctors, two agents, and they may be Bayes agents. So they have precise opinions about the state of the weather and all that, but they both agree that on medical grounds, no one should take the state of the weather as useful information about whether this patient is allergic or not. If you now take the set of probabilities generated by these two agents, both of whom judge the weather and the patient's allergic state as independent, and you take convex combinations, averages of their two distributions, you lose that independence. That is, the states which are independent, A and B, A being weather, A being state of the patient's allergic state, and B being the weather in Beijing. The state of distributions which make A and B independent are not convex. They live on a surface which is more complicated than a convex one. They live on a hyperbolic surface because you're requiring that A probability of A times the probability of B is the probability of A and B, which is the formula for a hyperbola, x times y equals z. And that's hyperbolic surfaces are like saddle shapes, and they are not convex. They undulate in two directions at once. So if you convexify this, and you say, I'm going to take a group opinion which takes the doctors and looks at their average, all the averages of their opinions, I will now produce a convex set whose the interior is no longer on the surface of independence between A and B. A and B become dependent. And when you have dependent information, you can learn about the one variable by reading the other. Your opinion about one changes by learning the other. That would mean if I took the convex combination of these two doctors' opinions, it would be legitimate, rather than conducting tests on the patient's allergic status, to go spend money to find out what the weather in Beijing is and use the conditional probabilities that come because of the dependence that you've introduced between the weather in Beijing and the state of allergic status. So the value of information would bounce back and bite you in saying, if I'm prepared to insist on these imprecise probabilities with convex sets, I will introduce dependencies which make observations relevant where they ought not be. Now, certainly the causal theorists will be delighted with this because they'll say, yes, this is a case of probabilistic dependence. That's not causal dependence. I think the problem is not that. The problem is that you've introduced dependencies through this device of convexifying this space by saying if A is a legitimate probability for a group and B is, then so is every average of A and B. If P1 is a probability and P2 is a probability, then every average of P1 and P2 is a legitimate probability. And this says the value of information stops you from defending that because it will introduce value of information where you don't want it. At least I would think you would not be happy if the doctors who were disagreeing decided to resolve their difference by saying, let's go check the weather in Beijing. And that will determine whether we give you drug A or drug not A. I don't know if that makes sense. It's a bit of mathematics. It depends on, it's a mathematical point about convex sets and the fact that independence, the relation of independence is not convex. And so if you introduce convexity into these imprecise probability models, you will introduce statistical probabilistic dependencies that will create a value of information in learning one observation for predicting a second where you don't want it, because you've introduced a dependence you don't want to have. A bit of mathematics, but a practical lesson that comes out of it.
Right. Okay. And then, so I don't know, it would be helpful to give it maybe an example of how this could play out.
Well, there is in a paper that we've written where that very example is pursued, but it's to show that the mathematics of the imprecise probability has substantive. It's not just a formal convenience to introduce convexity. It has a substantive content, and that content will ramify through the value of information result that we were discussing a while ago, to say that if you convexify, you will introduce dependencies in the probabilities that suggest there's value in learning X when you want to know Y, where that may be inappropriate. And the cause, I would say, for the inappropriateness is the convexity itself, because you're introducing dependence where you don't want to introduce it. The convexity introduces the dependence. It forces you off the surface of independence, or forces you to go from one side of the surface of independence to the other, from the negatively correlated to the positively correlated. Those are judgments you don't want to introduce just for the convenience of convexity.
Right. So it's not just something that has no. It's just like
it's not a mathematical simplification.
Right.
It's got substantive content that we can produce through this other result we were discussing about the value of information. So I'm saying the imprecise probability theory has to watch out that certain mathematical conveniences surprisingly can have substantive content through the decision theory. And this is an example, a subtle one, but an important one, about whether you want to introduce convexity in your imprecise probability models or not. Watch out for conditional dependencies you introduce. Causal reasoning, I think, will not do well with this willy-nilly convexity assumption. You will destroy causal relations understood as conditional dependencies and probabilities.
Right. Yeah, and I did want to note that there's another article you talked about this. There's independent motivation to allow for imprecise probabilities in the case of like even in individuals. A, because, well, it might just be like the precise probabilities across the board might be like sort of psychologically implausible, and also, well, we might have imprecise or like sort of indeterminate evidence, and so maybe it's kind of rational to have imprecise credences based on that. And so if you take that seriously, then yeah, what's the problem in having imprecise probabilities in our decision model and so on?
Yes, there are many stimuli for shifting away from one distribution to a set. And I was in the last half hour or so, we've been discussing ramifications when you represent a group with a set of precise, whether the group is a single person treating himself as this indeterminate agent, or whether it's an authentic group. And then the question is, what's the nature, what's driving the imprecision? Is it for that reason because you're trying to do consensus or robustness, or is it some other reason because of lack of perfect introspection or precision to the introspection? You don't know whether you prefer A to B. You don't want to force a decision that depends on whether you prefer A to B or not. And indifference, of course, is yet another very delicate. A indifferent to B is not robust over whether A is better than B or B is better than A, because A indifferent to B is like a knife edge. A little bit of perturbation can make it go either way. So it's very unrobust.
Right.
So you don't want to try and capture that kind of indeterminacy with indifference. Of course, indifference is the opposite of robust.
All right, you had this other paper with Gigi Zhang and Halen Yu on subjective causal networks and indeterminate suppositional credences.
Yes, that's with Gigi Zhang and Hailan Yu.
Yes. I might have mispronounced the names. But
no, it's all right. Both of whom were graduates of the CMU philosophy department, Carnegie Mellon philosophy department. That's where I met them.
Right. And in there, well, maybe you can talk about it if you want, but you explore like, well, okay, if you can start with a Bayesian network, you can consider the causal structure, and then you can also have sort of imprecise suppositional credences and so on. I don't know. Maybe do you want to talk a bit about the stuff you explore in this paper?
Well, I think it ties up with the example which I was fumbling to describe about the problem in using convex sets when you're sensitive to judgments of conditional probabilistic dependence and independence. So if you're doing causal analysis in the spirit in which it comes out of the CMU philosophy department, the theory of Spurdy's, Gleamore, shyness, then you're taking very seriously when conditional dependencies and independencies obtain in order to analyze causal relations. And then the question is, how can you take advantage of the imprecise probability machinery to be more robust than a traditional Bayesian and do causal inference that way? That's kind of the framework for the problems that Gigi and Hyland and I were looking at. And what Mark and Jay and I had already worked on was the fact that you couldn't have convex sets without risking to destroy those critical causal independence and causal dependence relations as reflected by conditional probabilities that are dependent or independent. Again, the problem is that convexity doesn't keep track of these critical causal relations understood as conditional dependencies or independencies. So what Gigi, who works very closely in this area, and Hyland and I were working on, is given that Mark and Jay and I have a theory which doesn't require convexity, could we, but still permits indeterminacy, sets of probabilities, could we merge the two and use the sets of probabilities machinery without building in convexity? And that's what that framework is about. It's meant to show how to use imprecise probabilities in a setting where you're not assuming convexity. And again, the reason you don't want to assume convexity is because you want to keep careful attention on when you have conditional dependencies or independencies. And that's exactly what the convexity overrides or ignores. So this is a paper which talks in a preliminary way about doing causal reasoning, statistical causal reasoning, with sets of probabilities without convexity, so that you can keep track of the causal dependencies you want while still being indeterminate on their values. I may want to say A and B are independent, but I'm not using a single distribution. I want a set of distributions that make A and B independent. Then you'll be sitting on this saddle-shaped surface, which is not convex. What's the decision theory that goes with that? Well, you need a decision theory with imprecise probabilities without convexity, and that's what Mark and Jay and I have developed. So that's the setting for why that marriage, that merger of ideas is being entertained. And at this point, I don't know of any other accounts that allow you to use sets of probabilities without convexity and still have a well-defined decision theory. So that was at some point that our theory may get superseded by better theories with indeterminate probability without convexity, or other ways of handling independence more accurately. But at this point, that's the only game in town, I think. You don't have a good menu of alternatives.
Good. Yeah. One thing just sort of wondering at the outset, like, what I mean, if we're good Bayesian, so to speak, what is it that's added when we talk about the sort of causal structure and the causal inferences? In other words, we might worry that that's not, if we already have all the relevant, statistical
Well, I
information.
think you want. I think the causal inference material is important when you have particular options which meet the requirements of what are called an intervention. Now, I'm not speaking for Peter, for Spurdes or Shyness or Gleamore. But comes from many, many conversations with them. I think you want to be able to imagine interventions which formally, policy actions, maybe group social actions, which formally fit the form of an intervention. What an intervention is causally is to change one variable without changing predecessor values, causal antecedent values. That would be like a causal, like to get back to the Newcomb problem, the way you're trying to say, I can choose one box or two without affecting how the predictor made it. The predictor's made his choice or her choice or its choice. That's fixed. And now I want to be able to choose one way or the other without changing that. That would be an intervention. Of course, whether you think that's possible is part of what's controversial about the Newcomb problem. But in real life, that's what you want to be able to do. I've got the genes I've got. What happens if we institute a policy where I don't smoke? How does that affect my cancer? If I'm going to get it or not. And causal inference would be the kind of inference that says, yeah, there are real life interventions that are possible. You want to see what the causal consequences of those are, because that's what's going to determine the right decisions. The conditional probabilities will reflect the fact that this is an intervention. Am I making sense about bringing together the parts we've talked about?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess if the causal description just adds, and talking about as an intervention, just adds that, well, maybe in some sense it's independent from what happened previously, and it is what happens subsequently is dependent on it probabilistically.
Well, let me go a little step further. Let me go
Sure.
a little step further. We want to have these judgments empirically grounded. So you're going to be looking at data. The data may not come from interventions. They may be observational studies. I can't claim that the observations are the same frequencies I would expect if I could intervene. So under what conditions can I learn? Because when I introduce the policy, I will intervene. I will make everyone not smoke or something like that, regardless of what they were disposed to do on their own in the observational study. So under what conditions can I go from data based on an observational study to a different decision based on interventions? And that's what I think the legitimacy of all this causal theory for is, to guide policy decisions or actions where you think you are intervening in a technical sense.
But again, so the fact that it's a intervening, or that there's a causal connection here, is that carrying more information or more relevant information than just what that predicts with respect to being probabilistically sort of independent of what came previously, and it also has certain expectations for what could happen.
I mean, if this is the first time we're doing an experiment where we intervene, then all our observations are merely observational studies, and we can't the question is, under what conditions can we go from frequencies observed in observational studies to judgments of conditional probabilities for interventions? Because the policy is going to be acting as an intervention. I'm not going to be the policy is going to say everyone in a certain class has to do something regardless of the other factors that are already fixed. That's an intervention. But if the basis for that are results that come from observational studies where people were choosing what to do without intervening in the formal sense, then the question is, how do I successfully perform the statistical inference that will allow me to use observational studies to guide interventions? And you might want statistics that are more robust than traditional canonical Bayesian theory. And that's where the imprecise probabilities would come in. You'd want to take advantage of the uncertainty that you have about the observational studies situation. You don't know really what was causing what in the observational studies. and you would like results that are robust under an intervention.
Right. So where would you think that a model like this would be relevant in everyday life? Do you think this would be important?
Yeah, I think that's what's. I think most of the data will not. I mean, it's rare that you can benefit from well-designed experiments to guide the policy. A lot is going to have to come with imperfect experiments, aspects of the experiment which are only observational, where you don't control the treatment to the level of degree you would like, and you haven't randomized. And so the causal theory, as my colleagues have developed it, will allow you to justify policy decisions even when the empirical basis is merely observational as a result of some loosely qualitative assumptions or imprecise probability type assumptions that don't depend on a particular. You'd like that reasoning not to rest on a particular subjective Bayesian model when if you changed some of the probabilities a little bit, it would change the policy decision. You want a robust analysis. So that's where I think the connection between the two is legitimate for practical purposes, not just for theoretical pretty purposes.
Right. But again, so the main sort of shot of this paper was developing a decision theory or a model where you can have causal Bayesian networks with imprecise probabilities and X state dependence, right? I think was the main point.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and then getting into some of the more details.
The X state dependence is modeling the interventions.
Right.
That's why there's X state dependence. Of course, when you intervene, you change probabilities for features downstream of your action, not upstream of your action. And that's where the causal distinction comes into play. And you want to get the properties of the intervention right. You don't want to confuse conditional dependencies and independencies. So you need a theory of imprecise probability that doesn't automatically impose convexity. That's where that mathematical assumption has to be avoided like the plague.
Now, does this assume that intervention or causation can never go backwards, so to speak?
Yeah, as far as I know, I think the temporal factors are always constraining causal dependence.
Although, I mean, you might think that that's not ruled out a priori, and like it could be.
Yeah, but I think in all these policy decisions,
yeah,
the intervention is downstream in time.
Yeah, because I don't know, you might have some. This is maybe not realistic situations or like policy situations, but you might think that there's like I could even see someone saying like in the Newcomb case, no, the way I want to think about intervention and causation, in a sense, you are intervening on what the predictor predicted and so on. So this is sort of backward causation, even if it's sort of stipulated in the problem that there's no.
If it's that's right. Then it starts to get strange.
Yeah.
How I'm thinking of act state dependence when I want to see this as an intervention. I think the claim that it's an intervention is the controversial one because this is where I mean, for example, you would not believe Newcomb if there was authentic mixed strategies involved. If I could flip a coin, which was saying you cannot predict, no one can predict how the coin's going to land, or use radioactive decay, or whatever you think is the most robust of those that don't have anticipatory models, then if someone came along and said the predictor has this ability to predict what you're going to do, I say, I don't believe you. I mean, try and do Newcomb with mixed strategies. I think the model is incredible.
Yeah, isn't it added in the like if the predictor predicts that you do something like that, it just puts nothing in the opaque box or something like that.
You know, that's predicting my choice, but I'm saying the predicting the outcome of the mixed strategy.
Yeah, it's just a sort of magic or something. Okay.
Anyway, but I that's why I don't think the Newcomb case is helpful for understanding what's real about this concern with observational studies and policies which are being modeled as interventions. I think everyone is trying to get that right, and it's not like there are two boxers who are advocating the wrong solution, or one boxers who are advocating the wrong solution. I think everyone's agreed about what kind of causal reasoning you're trying to model as expected utility maximization given an intervention.
Right. And so this can then just be applied, sort of going back to the stuff about groups. I mean, this could be applied to groups as well in the same sort of way, or
which is this now? I'm not.
Just
You
having
mean the causal intervention?
Yeah, intervention and just having a causal network.
Yeah, I mean the point is that I mean the treatment. It might be that you want an indeterministic probabilistic model for treating one subgroup. I mean, I may know what's going on with the men, and I may not know what's going on with the women, and I may be comfortable with a precise model for the treatment of the men, but for the women, I don't know, and I want to use an imprecise probability with the right causal modeling for the women. So that's the subgroup doesn't have, that is what you do for one subgroup doesn't have to apply for all of them, all the other subgroups. You can have a mixture of where the imprecision arises because of lack of information. I can give you an example of where that arose in practice in a very simple. This was work that Jay Cadane led the way in the late 80s. There was a clinical, we were looking at an adaptive clinical trial problem where the concern is on ethics under randomized trials. You have to, I mean, the evidence, unless it's conclusive, leaves both legs of the treatment A, treatment B open. And if you're doing randomization, you may wind up randomizing between treatment A and treatment B when you want to say, given what I've seen for the subgroup, which is this person's subgroup, medically classified, treatment A is doing much, much better. It would seem to me to be ethically questionable whether under such circumstances I want to randomize for the sake of the study between treatment A and treatment B for this particular individual, given what we've seen thus far. And Jay led a group of statisticians. We had some lawyers, ethicists. Ken Chaffner was in the group. And we used sets of probabilities to model what was going on by using a variety of expert opinions. Each expert opinion was a precise Bayesian model, but we allowed the Bayes models to be updated by what was observed in the trial so far. And you could differentially say, for this subgroup, it's pretty clear that treatment A is better than treatment B. For this other subgroup, treatment B is better than treatment A. And for this third one, we still have no resolution in an indeterminate way. And this was done with treatment allocations that never gave to a subject who was a patient also a treatment that was ruled out by this unanimity rule of the experts. If all the expert models say, given what we've seen so far, for this type of patient, A is better than B under all our models, then we don't want to give B to this person. That's an evolving judgment because that for later patients, that judgment can get reversed. But at the time at which the judgment is made, you're ethically prohibited from violating the unanimity rule. That's the basis for justifying the unanimity rule. It's an ethical consideration. I want to be a Kantian and say, this person, if all the expert models say A is better than B for this individual, then to give the individual B up by randomization in order to learn about the treatments in the study is clearly violating the Kantian dictum that I want to treat this individual as an end first and a means to information only after respecting the individual as an end. And so that's where we use the Pareto condition as a way of enforcing a Kantian ethical standard. But where the unanimity didn't apply, some models say A is better, some models say B is better, then at least on ethical grounds you can consider other reasons for giving the subject A or B, as for example, which will allow me to learn faster about the treatments by balancing sample sizes and avoiding the paradox we were talking about before. So to be specific again, just to finish up that last point, in this trial, when neither of the two treatments was unanimously recommended by the set of models, then you were allowed to appeal to other considerations on ethical grounds who weren't violating Kantian restrictions. And so you could look to balance sample size so as to avoid the concern with Simpson's paradox. But you couldn't do that if the models were all recommending the same treatment for this individual. So that's an application of imprecise probabilities in decision making, which I don't think you can get using precise Bayesian maneuvers.
Yeah, I mean, and this gets a bit more technical as well. I don't necessarily want to get into all the details there, but yeah, I did want to bring up one other kind of topic that I looked at this paper with you and a few other authors, including Joseph Cadane and Shervich, but also Raphael Stern and Jesse Szewski, I'm not sure. On Sleeping Beauty's credences, and some of the viewers may be familiar with the Sleeping Beauty problem. I'll just state it briefly, just for sake of the audience. So, in the Sleeping Beauty problem, Beauty's taking part in this experiment wherein she'll be put to sleep on Sunday, and a fair coin is going to be flipped sometime before Tuesday anyway. And if it lands tails, she is woken on Monday and Tuesday. And if it lands heads, she is woken on Monday only. And each time she is woken, she does not know the outcome of the flip or what day it is or whether she's already been awake, but she otherwise understands the details of the problem, of the procedure. And as well, she knows that each time she's woken, she'll be asked, what is the probability that the coin landed heads? And the question is then, like on some occasion where she's woken and interviewed, what is the correct probability for her to report? I mean, it's difficult to phrase this precisely or uncontroversially, but and then anyway, the most accepted answer here is actually 1/3 as far as I can tell. And although there's also an argument for a half, which you might think is the intuitive answer because it's a fair coin, right? I mean, you should say it's a probability half that it came of heads. She hasn't learned anything new and so on. But anyway, could you talk a bit first sort of about this problem? How we get the halfer or a thirder or even other results?
So the context in which this arose was not philosophy, it was game theory. It had to do with modeling sequential games where there's evolving information sets. Information sets say what one player knows, another what the players know. And the question arose, what happens if you have a model in which the player returns to the same information set as she or he had before? And that requires an unusual form of forgetting, because just returning to the same information set means that everything you knew is the same. It wouldn't allow you to remember that you had been here before and this is my second visit. That would not be the same information set. So the games that support this question, how do you reason when you can reach the same information set more than once, all involve a kind of forgetting. And there are different versions of this depending on the kind and nature of the forgetting. Whether you always forget, only sometimes forget. So you can see many variations on this. The Sleeping Beauty problem was one that hit the general literature, though I think the economists had already been well into this debate. And the problem is, if you're a Bayesian, how do you model what's going on? Let me cut to the quick and say what the five of us thought was the right way to do this. And it comes up supporting, depending on the details, sometimes half or sometimes thirder, but it does show that certain models of reasoning that people were going through were invalid regardless the other question of half or third. So the way we model it is to say Sleeping Beauty, thinking of Sleeping Beauty as the agent, and we're trying to get Sleeping Beauty's perspective, knows all through the game whatever she knew on Sunday before she was put to sleep. So she knows the rule of the game and all that. And what we're saying is what she should do is use that and the priors, the joint distribution that come from that, to update that with whatever she knows at a given moment in playing the game. And the point is that since she's forgetting, she may know more at an earlier stage than she does at a later stage. So, but the way you handle this is because she forgets, is you say, I start with my joint distribution and I update on what I know at the time I'm being investigated. And now you get into details on Sleeping Beauty. Does she pick up any other details on one time being awake than another? Does she have an itchy nose on one day and not an itchy nose on another? And What's her model for that going on, and so on. All these issues arise because what you're doing is you're saying, I'm a Bayesian on Sunday, I have a joint distribution, and I'm awake, and now I know whatever I know. I know I have an itchy nose, or I know I don't have an itchy nose. And how does this influence my opinion? Well, it depends on the model that I think I'm going to have an itchy nose on both days, because if I think the only day I can have an itchy nose is on Monday, that's quite informative about how the coin landed. I mean, sorry, if the only day I can have an itchy nose is on Tuesday, that's highly informative of how the coin landed, because I'm only awake on Tuesday if the coin landed tails. I won't get to be awake. I mean, that would be an extreme case. Anyway, so what we do is go through and set up a general framework for how this is to be analyzed, and it depends on Sleeping Beauty's view about kinds of experiences she might have on Monday or Tuesday. And depending on the mathematical details of that, she will be a half or a third, or many other values could arise. It depends on the details. But one thing which I think is important is that when analyzing this, from her perspective, being awake and being asked on Monday is not a disjoint event from being awake and being asked on Tuesday, because when the coin lands tails, she's awake on both. And if really she cannot tell one from the other, then from her point of view, those are indistinguishable and they both occur. Everyone would agree she's awake on Monday and she's awake on Tuesday. And the question is, has she a way of distinguishing these? And depending on how you fill out those details about what she might learn when she's awake, it may be that she can't distinguish them at all. And so she has to treat them as both occurring. When she says, what day is now, the word now is ambiguous. And in her mind, and her experience cannot be resolved as different than the Monday awakening and Tuesday awakening. So in her mind, when she's asking now, she has to understand she's asking both on Monday and Tuesday because they both occur. She can't say, now I mean Monday, now I mean Tuesday. She can't do that. She doesn't have the wherewithal to distinguish. Unless the details are such, like the itchy nose, she does, in which case she may forget, but she may have a tip-off, a cue as to which day it is based on something she's experiencing. In any event, the key is not to confuse Sleeping Beauty's perspective with the outsider's perspectives, who are aware all along whether it's Monday or Tuesday, because they're the ones who have to wake her if the coin lands heads or tails, whichever way it goes. Does that get at what's going on? At least that's what I think is important in that paper. It's modeling forgetting in a Bayesian way, and the way we do that is to say there's a common joint, which is the prior, which she carries all the way through the experiment from Sunday through whenever she's awake, and she just updates on what she knows and what she knows about the dynamics of that process. And in those dynamics, being awake on Monday may not be a disjoint event from being awake on Tuesday, because she doesn't have access to the usual notion of now, to temporal indexical. When she's awake and she says now, she cannot distinguish in the pure case of the problem, where you're really revisiting the same information set twice. She cannot distinguish the now on Monday from the now on Tuesday if she's awake on both.
Right.
And so she has to update and come to the same conclusion on both.
Yeah. So maybe part of the idea here is, maybe let me make sure that I'm following. Common sort of half-er reply is to say, look, whatever she knew at the outset, she hasn't learned anything new now. It's all the same. She should have the same probability now as she did before.
Yes. It's got to be everything. And that's a theorem we get. The only way you can be a half-er is that the experiences of what happens on Monday if she's awake are identical as viewed from Sunday. That is, the probabilities assigned on Sunday, that whatever she will experience on Monday, however you want to refine her ability to experience it, it must be identical with what she can experience on Tuesday where she awake, because if there are any variables where she believes she will get a different reaction of some sort Monday from Tuesday, that no longer she's no longer a halfer. She's going to have some more complicated model. So it really must be pure that way, that everything, including nose itches and dryness of mouth and anything else, spotting a fly dashing across the room, a common housefly, all those experiences are relevant as potential tip-offs as to whether it's Monday or Tuesday, or changing the probability that it's Monday or Tuesday. And the only way she can be a halfer in this is a theorem we prove, is that she has the model that with probability one, whatever she experiences on Monday, were she awake on Tuesday, she would have identical experiences. Anything else will destroy the halfer model. Now, the thirder model is more complicated and also is extreme because she has to believe that anything that she can, if she's always a thirder, then anything that she might experience on the one day, she cannot experience on the other day. To be a thirder, you cannot have the identical experience because that would make you a halfer.
You can't have identical experience between the two. But
no, because the marginal probability, because I mean, these are just calculations now. You just work out the probability calculus. And if she's having the same, if her probability is I'm going to experience exactly the same thing on Monday as on Tuesday, where I awake on Tuesday, then she has to be a halfer. So to be a thirder, she must view some experience as potentially different.
But what about the thirder argument that just goes from like, okay, the probability that it's Monday, given that it's tails, is equal to probability that it's Tuesday, given that it's tails. Okay, so you can infer that the probability of tails and Tuesday is equal to
that. What does it mean? It means, what does it mean? I'm not understanding. The time is marching on. Monday is Monday, Tuesday is Tuesday. What does it mean? The probability it's Monday.
When she's
awoken?
when she's interviewed, yeah.
Yes, but that whose probability is it? Her probability, or the interviewer's probability?
Her probability.
Yeah, but how does she distinguish Monday from Tuesday?
Well, she doesn't know.
How does she distinguish? But if she doesn't know, then she's responding to exactly the same question. It's the same question for her. So,
but why would that make a difference? I guess
because it's both Monday and Tuesday. It's Monday when she's awoken on Monday, and Tuesday when she's awoken on Tuesday. You want her to have probabilities about what the outsiders see as the day on the clock.
Well, yeah, his probability is about what the actual day is, and I mean that's gonna when she's and that's gonna happen twice, I guess, if it's tails on 2 different days.
Yes, and once if it's Monday,
right,
and once if it's head, right. So what does that? Why does that? But remember, both occur. They're not disjoint events.
Right.
She's awoken both on Monday and on Tuesday. She's awoken on Monday if she's awoken on Tuesday, if and only if she's awoken on Monday, given that it's tails. So it's one event. It's not 2. The probability that it's Monday is the same event on Monday as the probability that it's Tuesday, given that it's Tuesday when the coin lands tails, because the 2 events they're not disjoint.
Well, they're not disjoint, but it's still.
So the probability, but they're different events, but in the probability model, the one occurs if and only if the other occurs.
Right.
So when you say it's Monday, you're trying to distinguish them in ways that is unavailable to her, because then you're saying I can have the one event without the other event.
Well,
she can be asked if she knows she's only going to be asked on Monday whether it's Monday, but if she's going to be asked on both days whether it's Monday.
So yeah, she doesn't. They're not disjoint, of course. There's this one occurs only.
But that means the probability of their union is not the sum of the probabilities. The probability of their union can be a half, even though each one is a half. The probability that it's Monday when she's asked on Monday, or the probability that it's Tuesday when she's asked on Tuesday, is not the sum of those 2 separate events, because they are the same event in the stochastic process. The process has when it lands tails, she's awoken on Monday and she's awoken on Tuesday. This is the part of the paper which deals with the mistake that we found going on, where people were treating the question as if from the perspective of the outsiders who know that Monday, when asked on Monday, is a disjoint event when asked on Tuesday. You could do one without the other. Because when the coin lands tails, you only ask her, or whatever it was. One can be asked without the other, but not when the coin lands the other way, from her perspective. Both events occur.
Yeah, both events occur, but they're still separate events, even if she can't distinguish them.
Well, but separate, not in a probabilistic disjoint sense.
Right.
The probability that it's one or the other is not the union, the sum of the probabilities. The probability that it's Monday or Tuesday is not the sum of the probability it's Monday and the probability it's Tuesday, because from her perspective, those are one and the same event. If she can't distinguish them. If she can distinguish them, it's a different problem. Because it's a different problem for the people
Right.
who are outsiders, for whom it's a 1-0 event and then a 0-1 event.
Right, so then in the kind of pure Sleeping Beauty problem, I think as it was originally posed, then do you think the right solution is the half solution? Then is that what I'm saying? Where she doesn't
In
have
the
any
pure
limits.
solution where there's no right, if you take the extreme solution that her model requires that everything down to the last detail, she might observe, notice when awake on Monday will be repeated exactly on Tuesday in the same way, then you get a half solution. And that's the only condition under which you get a half solution. Anything else, you get something else.
Interesting.
That's the theorem we proved.
Interesting. It was my understanding that that was not the kind of popular view in response.
The popular view, I think the popular view tries to make the Monday event disjoint from the Tuesday event by using what are called centered events.
Yeah.
And the centered events, I think is a conflation of her view with the outsider's view. I've challenged the people who use them to say what random variable is the centered event, and they cannot give it. That's why we formulate the analysis with random variables defined in the usual way. What is the centered event that it's Monday that she's talking about? If you mean the event that it's Monday from the perspective of the outsiders, that's probability 1 on Monday and probability 0 on any other day for them. It's never a half-half.
Right, because the outsiders know the day that it is.
Right. And for her, the word now is ambiguous. That's the key. What does now mean?
Well, I mean, it's ambiguous in the day that it refers to, but it's not ambiguous in the sense that it just means whatever day that it is, which I'm making this utterance or something like that. But that's not enough, I guess.
I mean, you can have probabilities evaluated on Monday and probabilities evaluated on Tuesday. It's a value of random variables that take different values on different days, possibly. But the word now, I don't know what that means in this setting. Because she's going to hear now on Monday, if she hears now on Tuesday as a question or puts it to herself as a question. It has to occur exactly the same.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So, like, we have to understand.
So this is the section of the paper which explores with random variables where the fact that the Monday and Tuesday awakenings are not disjoint events. They both occur from a probabilistic point of view. It's a stochastic process. You're getting both of them. If the coin lands tails, the day she's woken, that's the circumstance where she's woken twice.
Right.
And to convert those into betting odds, that's a separate confusion, because since the bet has to repeat, you're doubling the stake on days when she's woken twice. That is, the net effect from the ex ante point of view on Sunday is the stake is doubled because the bet is doubled. And when you double the bet, when one event occurs but not the other, that's not an elicitation of my degrees of belief. If I think the coin is fair and you tell me the stake will be doubled when it lands tails before you know it, that is, if in fact the stake is forced to double when you land tails, then if I think it's a fair coin, I'll give you odds of 1/3. My credence is a half, but my betting odds will be 1/3 because you've changed the formulation. It's no longer a diffinating bet because you're making the stake, the size of the stake, function of the outcome of the bet.
Right. Yeah. I can see how that could come apart in that way.
Yeah, so they come apart in that setting because the stake is doubled because in effect you've made two bets only when the coin lands tails.
Right.
And then you just solve it. You say, if I think with probability a half, I'll be betting once, and with probability a half, I'll be betting twice. But when I bet twice, it's a tails event, and I think it's probability a half heads tails. What should I announce? My odds are 1/3. That's easy calculation. So I think my credence is a half, but my announced betting odds for that kind of bet is 1/3. So that's not evidence for a credence of a third. That's in fact evidence for credence of a half.
Right.
The people who use that argument, it backfires on them. If they think that she should announce betting odds of a third, then in fact their credence is a half.
Right, because if you just go, here's the betting odds 1/3, here's the sort of the stakes given the number of times each bet is made,
Right.
then
Yeah.
you can reason backwards. Well, it must
And
be
half you're getting once and half you're getting twice.
Hmm.
And half you're getting once, half you're getting twice is half its heads, half its tails.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have to think about that a bit more because I don't know. I always found the third reply just sort of intuitive, but
I think the third reply is exactly the right reply for betting odds when your credence is a half.
Hmm.
But the question is, what's the credence, not what's the betting odds? And if you're just assuming that this is an ordinary bet where the announced betting odds give you the credence, then you're going to get confused and think that my credence is a third. If my credence is a third, I should announce different betting odds still.
Right.
I shouldn't announce a third. I should announce something else because the stakes are still being doubled.
Yeah. I could see. I wonder to what extent there's this worry that like what the probabilities are supposed to measure here is like not very well defined, and maybe there's different.
Yeah, I mean, you could be talking about occasions when I win the bet, and repeat that where you double the number of times you bet under one outcome of the coin, not under the other. You can do that, and then the announced odds of 1/3 have to do with the expected frequencies or the long run frequencies of winning. But it's not a Diffinetti bet. It's not the kind of bet that's supposed to measure a credence. Because, look, it's the same. I'll give you another example to show you when it comes apart. Suppose this is one of my favorite examples of this sort. We've just met. I mean, we've had some correspondence, but I certainly haven't looked into your history. And suppose I'm being asked to bet on whether your mother's birthday is an odd or an even day of the month. And I know the person I'm betting against is you. This is not some arbitrary opponent. This is you. I have to announce odds for you to bet against me. Diffinetti's game is sequential. The bookie has to announce odds first. The gambler comes along and decides which way to bet. You're the gambler. I know it. Now, if I thought it was just a measure of my credence, I would say 51% odd, 49% even, because I'm using a random birthday model. And 51% of the days in the year are odd days, 49%. But I won't say that against you. Why? Because you know, and I know you know, your mother's birthday, and you'll put me on the losing side of the bet and then make me lose whatever money I have to bet with. So if I announce anything other than 0-1, you will put me on the losing side of the bet, and you will take away as much money as I've got to bet with. So I won't say 0-1. I won't say, I will say 0 or 1. I will say whichever one gives me a chance of breaking even, because that's the best I can do. So if I think it's an odd or an even random birthday, I will say probability 1, your mother's day is odd. Because now in my opinion, with probability 0.51, at least I break even because the losing side of that bet costs me nothing. And if I'm wrong, I lose my money anyway. So that's an extreme case of where if the stake is going to be, because you're choosing stake as +1 or minus, positive or negative, whichever side you want me to put me on. You're choosing the side of the bet, which is the sign of the stake. That if the stake is a function of the outcome, and I'm assuming you know your mother's birthday, so you're certainly a function of the outcome, my announced betting odds will not necessarily be my credences. In this case, it's an extreme strategic betting odd I announce. I announce 1 if I think it's probability a half or more, or 0 if it's a half or less. It's a half, I can announce either. And that gives me at least some chance of walking away without losing my money. I have no chance of winning in this game.
Right, but any other bet you would have, it would just be a guaranteed loss, right?
That's right. Any other bet I have, and if you can raise the stakes arbitrarily, you'll take away all the money I have to bet with. I'm not a sure loser in any sense, but I will lose all my money for sure if I announce. But the Sleeping Beauty is just another variant of that, where the state is being changed as a function of the outcome. In this case, doubled. It's a little bit less extreme than what you're doing when you make me bet one way or the other way, depending on the event, because you know the event. I mean, it's like letting you. I mean, you ask me to bet on whether the horse wins or loses, and you get to decide after you've seen how the race turns out. If that's what I have to do, I'm going to use extreme betting odds, because that's the only way I can break even. I can't win. You'll put me on the losing side of the bet.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I'd have to think more about it when it comes to Sleeping Beauty, but yeah.
Go back and think about Sleeping Beauty, and just keep track of the distinction between credences and announced betting odds. I say it boomerangs. If the person wants to say my announced betting odds is 1/3, 2/3, I'm saying wonderful, you're a halfer.
And then the other important thing about understanding what now or this day, how that functions.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. It's a stochastic process from Sleeping Beauty's point of view, in which when the coin lands tails, two observations will be made. And there's this maximal ambiguity as to which it is. And so the probability that it's one or the other is not the sum of the two, because you can't distinguish them as disjoint. That rule is the rule which applies to the outsiders who know you cannot have both a Monday and a Tuesday now. It's either Monday now or Tuesday now. So for them, the probability that it's either Monday or Tuesday is the sum of the probabilities. But for her, it doesn't work that way.
Right.
It's a very subtle point about, because she's literally reaching the same information state twice, if she's a halfer.
Right. Yeah. But then if there's anything else that she could use that would distinguish like Monday from Tuesday,
yes. But then it doesn't have to be. The thirder is an extreme model also. Right. Go back and look at the theorem in the paper.
It could be anywhere between half to a third, depending on the...
That's right. I could be outside as well, too, depending.
Oh, yeah, I guess you could have even other information.
Sure, you can learn whether the coin landed.
Right, exactly. She could see the coin, yeah. Fair enough.
Or she knows the only time her nose itches is on Tuesdays, and her nose is itching.
Yeah, it does seem to sort of hang together. I think, yeah, but anyway, interesting. So I guess we have been going for quite a while. I do normally end on a kind of meta philosophical question, if that's all right with you. I wonder what you think is the value of philosophy. Like, what maybe the value of decision theory, I guess, is a sort of interesting question. But like, why do you find this thinking about these things worth doing? What do you think the kind of importance of this stuff is? Yeah.
So I'll tell you. I'll answer with also a meta-philosophic. So I was part of the formation of the philosophy department at Carnegie Mellon. Clark Beemore was the nominal head. Wilfred Zieg, Dan Hausman, and I were the other relatively new tenured members to join the department. And one of the questions we had to decide is how are we going to build the department? And one thing we agreed on is that we're not interested in philosophers in the sense that they think there are problems that are philosophic and problems that are not philosophic, and they only want to study problems that are philosophic. That is not what we wanted. People who found problems interesting, and people outside of the academic discipline of philosophy also found interesting, because we thought that the value of the department we would be creating would be on an interaction between people who were trained with a certain philosophic perspective, but were finding issues that were important outside of that philosophic perspective. So it was an interdisciplinary. So I think Clark put it and said, well, if I'm interested in someone who wants to know, if we're looking at someone who wants to know whether this counts as philosophy or not, just from formulation of the problem, that's not someone we want to hire. We want to hire someone who says, here's an issue in philosophy of X. It looks interesting because it relates to, and then you could relate it to some issue that you had seen roughly in philosophy, but you were hoping then to bring philosophy and your training as a philosopher to bear on some other discipline. And if you couldn't do that, you weren't doing useful philosophy for us. So that's the metaphilosophic answer to your metaphilosophic question, based on how we actually did it.
Right. So the answer is like, well, because these philosophical issues, at least the ones we want to focus on or are interested in, are just have broader relevance anyways, already.
That's right. They have to have broader relevance. When we would interview people, we'd say, what non-philosophers do you discuss your problems with? And if the person said none, that person was not long for the candidates.
Yeah, definitely respect that approach. And it's, because there's this worry that philosophy, or it could happen in other domains too, where it just becomes just insulated in its own,
Yes.
activities, and it just kind of dies out with that,
Or it doesn't die out, but goes on perpetuating itself without ever.
Right.
Yeah, that's the model of philosophy. Jay has a joke. Jay Cadane has a joke. I'll end on that. He has a joke. He says, the true philosophy has 8 problems. He says, it's very important you not solve any, otherwise you'll deprive people of income from not having work to do.
That's good.
So the problems have to be implicitly without solution if that's your model of philosophy, because otherwise you're destroying the discipline. You wouldn't want to do that.
Right. That's funny. All right. So it's been, I think I'll draw the questions to an end there. It's been really great having you, Professor.
Yes, thank you very much. It's been a delight here as well. And if you want to pick up, it doesn't have to be part of an interview, but if you want to pick up with any of this, we have obviously shared interests. I'd be delighted to continue.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.